So yeah, I creatively copied the title of the book, which was partly my invention and partly the invention of my publisher. We had a very long discussion about this as to what it could possibly mean. So I'm just gonna I'll yeah, take it away. So, in a complaint to the Earl of Sandwich for the following Cook's second voyage to the Pacific, Georg Forster outlined what I think is a really interesting quote. Books are very dear, but a naturalist without them is like an artist without tools. And this, to me, really shows the centrality of books in the actual integrated practice of natural history during the late 18th and the early 19th century, rather than being sort of relatively separate entities. I mean, we seem to judge book history as being too separate as historians of science. I've tried to make clear that books were actually books and objects in the process of the multi-layered processes of natural history, ranging from collecting in the field to actually compiling books and producing them, their distribution, and then their use. Books and objects are really one of the same thing within these practices, and they're engaged with by a huge number of different people around the world. So in terms of the literature, we've seen quite a lot of attempts to process this in book history in particular, and this is probably one of the origins. This is Robert Darnton's famous communications circuit, published in 1982. And you can see he's quite general. I mean, I've never much liked the blobbing of economic and social conjuncture in the middle. And there's quite a lot of stick this has received, but also there's been quite a lot of revisions. There's many versions of this communications circuit coming out, but there hasn't actually been much interest in or much thought about how this can actually apply to the processes of science and natural history, particularly the publishing element. This is my version. There's slightly more on it. And I did get away with having this as a figure in this book. But this is basically me, and I'm sure there's a flaw. I know in Jim Secor's copy of my book, there's already a cross through one of these lines and another arrow on this somewhere, but at least he's finding it useful. This is my thinking of all of the possible approaches to producing a work of natural history in the late 18th and early 19th century. And what I try to do here is I try and trace it through from the actual processes of using these books and adapting them for essentially field research on either global voyages, local parishes, or on more perhaps emergence of national expeditions. Then you go through to the actual processing of this information and bringing it together, which also happens in the field. Then you've got all of these different crossovers with the emergent commercial publishing industry in the period. And this is actually a really interesting period for looking at science, but also scientific publishing, because what you start to see is the emergence of various markets, or also the non-emergence, and it starts to present far more options for natural historians to actually go about publishing. So I outlined sort of 5 main options going across here. Before then, these books go out into the world again and are used and engaged with by a huge range of different people. So this is me trying to draw together essentially the literature on book history and the literature on the history of natural history together. And I think exploring books as kind of tools in the process of knowledge production is really important for this. Many were central in the processes of organising and categorising information from across the globe and organising this according to the systems of classification. And in Britain, probably the 2 most prominent at this time were those of John Ray, developed in the 17th century, and the fairly new system of Linnaeus, obviously, that emerged in the mid-18th. And it's nice to have an audience where I don't have to go into vast amounts of detail about how these things actually work. And obviously, one of the most important things which I emphasise a bit more in this talk, which I discuss in this book, which comes throughout the book, are the voyages of James Cook, particularly the first one between 1768 and 1771. And I hope to, in this book, have presented a kind of tripart relationship emphasised by practices of collecting, compiling, producing, and then distributing knowledge on the natural world, and especially that which concentrates on botany in a period numerous historians have referred to as the beginning of a kind of global modernity. This period in the late 18th century, as I mentioned, is particularly productive, but something that has sort of caused issues for many of my colleagues who've worked on this time is that you've got to be quite selective of the material you actually look at, because when you start looking at it in detail, there just becomes too much. It's vast. And in this book, I mention many other collections which I just stumble across. But the main people who I look at, and I look at these because of the geographical range these individuals actually cover, but also their differing levels of wealth, for example, is the naturalist Joseph Banks, who really needs no introduction here, and then the naturalist Thomas Pennant, who very few people actually have heard of, but I think he's probably one of the most important British zoologists between Ray and Charles Darwin in the 19th century. Certainly had the most published output out of anybody. And his collection, actually, all the taxidermy, for example, all survives, in addition to all of his working notes held all around the world. I took me to Australia a few years ago, looking for those in the National Library in Canberra. And the collection of Gilbert White, who really didn't stray much further than his local parish in Hampshire, in Selborne, although his book, The Natural History and Antiquities of Selborne, does happen to be the most printed book in the English language after the Bible, the works of Shakespeare, and Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. So, it seems to have been quite successful. So for these individuals, natural history became central for defining themselves as gentlemen, demonstrating that they had sufficient time and leisure to undertake detailed systematic surveys of the natural world, while supporting the natural theological ideal of exploring the extent and utility of God's creation, while the practices it entailed also allowed these individuals to further define themselves as gentlemen, because they could show through undertaking these pursuits that their income primarily came from their own private land holdings, while natural history became central to some of the processes of improving these. Improvement was of really central importance in the 18th century. It was also important for building numerous global connections and participating in voyages of discovery, probably one of the most notable being Banks's participation in Cook's voyage in 1769. So travel formed an essential component in the processes and practices of natural history, with all naturalists in the period engaging with this in some way, whether this be short journeys around a local parish, national expeditions, and those who embarked on more extensive travels to examine the libraries, museums, and collections of those who travelled further afield. The emergence of local travels to survey natural history, a process that often took place over several years, resulted in the development of a whole variety of different paper structures, called by many, me included, paper technologies, designed to record, accumulate, and structure this information. Printed books remained really quite central for this. And this is one of the examples that I show in this book. This is my photo of Gilbert White's copy of William Hudson's Flora Anglica from the Houghton Library at Harvard. And the really interesting thing about this volume is that he puts a cross next to every species that he observes in his local parish, really parish of Selborne, really compartmentalising the geographical distribution of these particular species. Similarly, you see this in many, many books. If you go to any library, also libraries around here, you will not find, or you'll find far more copies of these books that are annotated than copies that are blank. Actually, I get really excited when I find a blank copy, especially if it's uncut, because there's more of a story behind why it hasn't been annotated than the annotated copies. Again, these notes by members of the Blackburn family of Orford Hall near Warrington. You can see pretty much every bird gets shot in natural history in the 18th century, shot. Hale, 1808, that's another one of their houses. The notes here, AB, means, actually my mouse has disappeared, there we go. AB stands for Anne Blackburn, daughter of John Blackburn, who compiled an extraordinary natural history collection at her home at Orford Hall. She really needs a lot more historical attention. This is just one of the many collections which I haven't been working on in detail, but just bounced before me through looking through some of this other material. You can even see that Pennant himself, in his tour of Scotland, describes her as having her own empire of natural history. And this is because she essentially acted as the governess, monitoring people in North America, several philosophers and her brother in North America, and she managed the connections between them and Britain, and also people between Britain and Peter Simon Pallas in the court of Catherine the Great in St. Petersburg. She was a powerful individual in these networks, and these are just some items from her collection that she sent to Thomas Pennant that survived. But this seems like it was a completely just vast array of material. These really just, this is actually coming from a national expedition, but you can really see how the links between these increased interests in defining the borders of emergent nation states through natural history is coming into the very parochial work of people like White, and I'll get on to that, how these parochial accounts kind of join together in a minute. This is one of the paper technologies that Pennant developed for taking on his tour of Scotland in 69. He went in 69. He went up the eastern coast of Scotland, right up the way to Land's End and John O'Groats. Something really interesting that Pennant does, and he does this consistently throughout his life, is he has a great interest in linguistics and language and meaning of words for species. So here we have the vernacular English names for a variety of amphibians and lizards. And here we have the ancient British, that is actually Welsh. We would refer to that as Welsh. Now, these are pretty accurate. Then here we have handwriting, which is not Pennant's, but we do at the top have Pennant's hand. And he was very good at giving the provenance for the information that he collected. The Erse names, that's the Scottish Gaelic, were given to me by Mr. John Gray of Helmsdale in Sutherland, near the Ord of Caithness in 1769. So what you see here is he's setting out with this appendix, interleaved appendix of his own book. Then he's actually getting people to add information to it. And you really see how this is a collaborative process. This is the map Pennant took for the 1772 tour of Scotland, for which he chartered the ship, the Lady Frederick Campbell, and you can see the line that he took here. This is an interesting voyage because it's far less contentious than Banks and the Cook voyages, because Pennant paid for everything. And he didn't have, for example, other sectors with different agendas on the voyage. So he paid for everything, he paid the crew, and they basically did everything that he required. And he was really, in Richard Sorenson's terms, really able to deploy this ship as a scientific instrument on this particular voyage. However, he never travelled alone. He travelled with an extensive team of natural history staff. This included John Stewart of Luss, Gaelic experts and a Linnaean botanist, Moses Griffith, his natural history artist who produced this illustration here, Louis Gold, a French valet who also used to shade Pennant when he needed it, and then an unnamed landscape painter, a hawker, a groom, a painter, and in addition to Archibald Thompson and the rest of the crew of the Lady Frederick Campbell. And you see all of these descriptions of him sailing the ship up to the cliffs so the geology and the strata could be observed, but also travelling alongside the basking shark. And this here is most likely the Lady Frederick Campbell, with the crew actually going out to harpoon the basking shark. It was of great economic importance because the oil was used in lamps, particularly in the outer islands at this time. So this is how Pennant is actually going about collecting information while travelling. He also, he used this information, but he made connections with people as he travelled. So every provincial member of the clergy, for example, every country gentry, he'd make a point of making himself known to them. He even prints or have printed forms printed to send out to gather information. And through gathering this information, he's actually able to draw lines across not just Britain, but also the wider world. I'm currently writing a paper on his book, The Arctic Zoology, in which he describes how the flora and fauna changes as you move from Svalbard to the equator in terms of its distribution and density. This is sort of becomes known as biogeography in the 19th century. But you can see here that Pennant is able to essentially describe these lines and says different flora is allotted above this line to what is allotted underneath it. So he does this quite a lot of different parts of the world. He also travels to view the major collections coming into Britain at this time. So this is one of the more extraordinary paintings by George Stubbs of the cheetah, stag and two Indian servants. Cheetah was brought to Britain by George Pigott, the former president of the East India Company, and given as a gift to King George III, where they then set it loose in Windsor Park. The idea was for it to go after and chase after the stag. It didn't really seem to recognise the stag, but I think it did savage a goat or something later on as a bit of entertainment for the nobility. But what Pennant did is he took his artist at this time, Peter Peho, French emigre artist, to view this picture in the Royal Academy. Then Peho extracted the image of the cheetah, and then Pennant had it published in his Synopsis of Quadrupeds, which is a big book organised according to Ray's system, through which he takes met 3 different editions, became the history of quadrupeds later on, but he takes people through all of basically the 4-footed beasts known in the world. But the interesting thing is he does not, unlike Linnaeus, include human beings in this. He has a real problem with including humans, and that's all to do with the classification of humans being one stage higher than regular animals between God and the angels. This is the notebook that Pennant took with him when he visited Joseph Banks and Daniel Solander in 1771. These are the animals observed and collected by Joseph Banks, Esquire, and Dr. Solander in the voyage around the world, begun August 25th, 1768, ended July 12th, 1771. And you can see here there's quite a lot of species from New South Wales and Botany Bay listed, in addition to notes by other people who he met on this trip to London as well. So Lieutenant Gore and he's added a bit about the Falkland Island foxes here that obviously Darwin observed 60 years later, now extinct. And Pennant, because he had this notebook, it was difficult to arrange information just in a notebook. It's useful going through chronologically as you see things, but you can't well cut the notebooks up. So what he does, and he copies this practice from Daniel Solander, who invented it essentially in the early 1760s. He devises these things called manuscript slips, essentially a kind of index card. And this allowed him to systematically order the names and descriptions of species according to whatever system he was interested in. This is another New South Wales slip. And the interesting thing about Pennant's collection is many of the species described in these notebooks actually survive. And these are some of the specimens from his collection, many of them almost certainly given by Joseph Banks. Unfortunately for some, the labels have become disconnected, so we don't have the actual exact provenance on these objects, but I think we can be pretty certain that the Rosella described in his notebook is also the Rosella in the collection. This must be the oldest specimen of a Rosella from this part of the world, from Pennant's collection, now held in Tring, a branch of the Natural History Museum. It's very, very rare to find any taxidermy at all from this time period. I'm now going to move on to some more, perhaps slightly more global travelling. And like Pennant, it was necessary to rely on a huge range of expertise to collect information successfully in the field. So here we have a chart, a diagram. I'm quite a fan of diagrams, but this is my invention, and this is kind of how I read the various tasks different people had on the Cook's first voyage, particularly the team hired by Joseph Banks, who obviously put about £4,000 of his own money up for this expedition, which £4,000 at this time was a simply vast sum. in the period. You could have bought, a farm or a small estate for the equivalent amount. And one of the things that he expended all this money on was actually paying the wages of all of these different people. So you've got really the first layer here with Banks's. And I was able to make this assertion really through analysing how often their handwriting appears in the manuscript archive. Banks's handwriting appears by far the least of anybody's. But what you can see is Banks sees himself much more as a general coordinator of what's going on and maintaining this very hierarchical structure, which actually fits in quite well with what he's used to. He owned vast tracts of land in Britain. He was running country estates, and he was really at the sort of top of society at the time. And he manages science like he manages a country estate. And so what you have here is close to Banks, working very closely with Banks, is Daniel Solander, the Linnaean apostle, obviously very famous. And then later on in Tahiti, you start to see this very, very close input from Tupaya in particular, who joins the team there. And you see this come out in the manuscript, so I'll talk about that in a minute. Then you've got the next layer of these far more sort of artisanal types. So you've got the two artists, Buchanan, who died of an epileptic fit in Tahiti, Sidney Parkinson. Then you've got the assistant naturalist or secretary, Herman Sperling. His handwriting probably appears the most out of anybody's in this whole archive. Then you've got the four specimen collectors and field assistants underneath, Briscoe and Roberts, servants from Banks's estate at Revesby Abbey in Lincolnshire. And then you've got Dalton and Richmond. They both died in a blizzard in the Tierra del Fuego, and they are actually of African descent, and Banks seems to have employed them in London. This is just the unfortunately, the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich wanted to charge me £200 to reproduce the high-resolution version, so I said no. I'm going to do the brainy version, but you can really see the social hierarchy and where they actually were in the space they inhabited on this voyage as well. This is one of the means through which they collected the botanical material in particular. This is the last surviving example of what Banks refers to as a book of specimens. Notes upon the 12 books of Paradise Lost collected from this Spectator, published in 1738. So this book was already 30 years old by the time Banks acquired these old printed sheets. They came from the back room of John Baskerville's warehouse in London, actually. Banks was very, very interested in New Baskerville through the Liver Society in London. That's the connection there. That's how the specimens are collected, and they're dried in these, what they call the drying books. The thing going on as the specimens are collected is Daniel Solander is probably, well, I think at times quite furiously writing in his notebooks. The thing you see in Tahiti within these notebooks is the consistent interest in the knowledge of native peoples they encounter on this voyage. So you see here, this is Solander's handwriting. And Linnaeus says this. Linnaeus says this in his instructions to travellers, that you should note down the native names where you touch shore, in case they might be of use later on. Solander doesn't just do this. He goes quite a lot more deeply into native uses for species, which I found really interesting. These are some of the many vocabularies that appear in, for example, this is the first instance in the Tahitian notebook of these names, which are, I call them I think they're sort of more semi-phonetic versions of Tahitian. Then you've got either English translations, again got Tahitian here, then you've got the various, either Latinate or some English. You've got cauliflower there, for example. These names, however, we've really got to take them with a pinch of salt. Remember, later on, particularly in New Zealand, you've got, so whoever's communicating the information, the Maori on the beach in New Zealand, then goes through Tupaya, a Tahitian, then goes to Solander, a Swede, who then writes it down in either English or Latin and sometimes in Greek. So it's from a number of different languages. It's already gone down by the time we actually see the written document is quite extreme. So some of the names actually become quite mangled. And I'm sure this is what's going on when, particularly when Cook writes down really odd names for places which have absolutely no relevance to the local languages. I was in Gisborne last week and discussing the name Cook actually gave to that part of the world, Tionawea, before he called it Poverty Bay. And I was talking to Somali because I hadn't had a real time working out what was going on. And he was like, oh yeah, I know exactly where that is. We're on it now. And Onawea means the long beach. And it's the longest beach for miles around. So, you know, you got a far more literal account of where they actually were in many of these cases. Also, with many of the botanical names, we've also just got plant or tree. So you've got to be really careful with what you're looking at. But for many of the species, they collected, they actually did record names that reflect of the specific names that they had in those parts of the world. This just emphasizes some of the just how temperamental some of these processes actually were. This quote was taken from Talvetta, who actually gave it to a gold prospector as an oral testimony in the 1840s when they were surveying the Coromandel coast for gold prospecting. For example, they collected grasses from the cliffs and kept knocking at the stones on the beach. And we said, why are these acts done by these goblins? Really interesting translation there. We and the women gathered stones and grass of all sorts and gave to these goblins. Some of the stones they liked and put them into their bags. The rest they threw away. When we gave them the grass and the branches of trees, they stood and talked to us, or they uttered the words of their language. Perhaps they were asking questions, and as we did not know their language, we laughed, and these goblins also laughed, so we were pleased. It wasn't quite so systematic as someone like Joseph Banks especially might want to make out in some of the accounts of this particular voyage. This is me actually in that very place about 18 months ago, and the amazing thing is this spot is quite unique because it's quite rocky, so it's never been converted to agriculture. And that Pahuta Kawa tree is about 700 years old. And it's the one that Banks et al. Walked under when they arrived on in that particular place. So this is Solander's New Zealand notebook. And I've selected a species here which did have this especially important meaning for the Maori throughout New Zealand. And this is the species Solander called Pippa mylisticum. It's now Pippa excelsum. The name was changed by Forster. Also, in vernacular, we know it as kawa kawa. It's essentially the New Zealand pepper. This species had great importance both medicinally and culturally for the Maori, and it still does. The interesting thing as to what Solander's doing here, though, is you see these, again, names, Chawa Chawa, Takuwawa, which relate to the actual name that he's hearing. And then he geo-references. So the POV there stands for Poverty Bay, and he's dated it in the front of the notebook. And OB stands for Okuruge, which is a peninsula off Mercury Bay. And again, he's dated it there. So I've been talking to some Maori linguists about this, and they think that it's actually a reflection on the different accents and dialects in language, which are far more widespread at that point in history. Lots and lots of accents have actually died out since European colonization. But that's what we think it means. Choice of the name myristicum also is really interesting, and he justifies some of this in the heavily sort of edit. You see how, you know, the process of this through all of these crossings out, it was never a perfect process. Myristicum is really interesting because it actually comes from the Greek derivative of myristikos, which means it refers to two things. It relates to great religious significance of this species, also its use in making a kind of ointment, and it still is used in that process. This is almost certainly information coming from Solander's observations, but also through Tupaya. I think the aspects of religion would not have come through just through Solander watching how it's being used, but this species is actually still used in various Maori ceremonies, particularly you know, before great sea voyages and things like that, and they dress the waka, the great sailing canoes, with it. This is just to give you an example of where these two particular places are. And here is some more of the the various geographical localities. So you see it towards the end of the notebook, he actually fills it out, and that's the original name, as I mentioned before, for Poverty Bay. This material from the notebooks is essentially recorded in the notebooks as he comes across it, in a chronology. And what we have here is, after they usually on board the ship, they then transfer this information for each species into the manuscript slip catalogue, a much more vast array of these kinds of index cards to what Thomas Pennant had. They're now bound, I think it might be 36 volumes in the Natural History Museum, and they were bound in the late 19th century. So you can see here the description of the Pippa myristicum changed to Excelsum later on. Then you've got the note referring to the illustration by Sidney Parkinson. And then we've got various names, again in Novis Zelandis, the languages of New Zealand. And then you've got the geographical localities. After this information gets transferred onto the slip, it seems that the notebook becomes redundant, and then they just keep updating the slip, which is why we've got more names on the slip here. These slips are also a vast, I wanted to digitise these as part of an ongoing project, but didn't have any money. But they're a vast resource for various vocabularies of Pacific languages as well. I don't think many people have looked at them, apart from botanists looking for senior synonyms, and they've just tended to flick past all of the sort of social and cultural material. But this is not an isolated example. I think I've found about 60 or 70, and I haven't gone through every single page in this, of these various vocabularies of useful information. So these are all terms for the words good to eat, which is useful if you're traveling across the Pacific and looking for economically important species, but also just the process of looking for food. Obviously, if you're on a voyage for 3 years, the food's going to run out. After these slips, these are then given to the secretary, Herman Sperling, who then transcribes the descriptions, the full descriptions, into this very neatly written manuscript, the Primae Florae Novae Zelandiae, but there's a version of this for every single geographical locality that they touched in, and you can see the various indigenous names here, but then a far, far better worked up description here. He had really nice handwriting, which has been important for one of my future projects, which I'll discuss in a minute. This information, the basics of this information, is then also included or transcribed into a copy of Linnaeus' Species Plantarum that they had with them on the voyage. This book, I don't know whether any of you are familiar with it, but it's basically 2 octavo volumes, not very large. This copy has been extended with quarto paper, so the actual format's been extended, but also it's been extended with so much paper that it's now bound in 6 volumes. So you can really see that even before this voyage, Banks expected to find a huge amount more than what was already known to European botanists. This is really the central kind of keystone in this whole process of managing information in relation to the flora of the globe that was already known in the period. This is just a zoomed in version of that description. You can see the Pippa myristicum notes up there. And then the final stages were the actual production of the illustrations by Sidney Parkinson. And I'm not going to read it all out, but you can really see, as I mentioned in that sort of hierarchy before, how Banks and Solander essentially commanded Parkinson to produce these images in a particular way. And the really fascinating thing with these particular images is that they're nearly all composites. They're not as we might see them. And obviously we know Daniel Bleichmar's work on the New Granada expedition in South America, and they're using a very, very similar approach to producing these illustrations. So this is the Pippa myristicum, or kawa kawa. It grows as male and female plants. They're 2 different varieties. But what we have here is Parkinson has actually morphed these distinct plants together. So you've got female flowers here, the male flowers behind. This is just an example. So that's the male flower there, and the female flower there. And they knew that it grew as distinct plants because they collected specimens of both different types. And this is really an attempt to make an idealized representation of the species, not of the sort of and it's not an attempt to make any kind of photographic representation or exact representation, for example. And I should add that these materials compiled on these voyages were never static at all. They're continually added to, and this is an example I really like. So you've got lots of notes by Jonas Dryander, Solander's successor. You've also got lots of notes that appear throughout this manuscript collection to Omai, which is Mai, who visited London after Cook's second voyage. And there's this extraordinary image, and lots of historians have written about this image, which really presents Banks as the kind of commander, again, with Solander writing. You see dozens and dozens of references to Omai appearing throughout this collection. There's been lots of speculation as to what Solander's actually writing in this image. Well, they must have spent days and days, hours and hours, going through and updating all of these names with what Mai actually thought about the plants in question. So I think that's what Solander's writing, but we can continue to speculate on that one. And I should just add, as we see this actually, there's the one bit of my book which received a bit of press interest earlier this year. But I got an IAA Impact Acceleration Account grant to digitise the New Zealand portion of these Solander manuscripts. Well, we've been able to do the Primate Flora and the original notebook and the images, but also producing a transcription. And because Spurring had such good handwriting, it's actually machine readable, which has allowed me to do it with a very small amount of money and not have to employ too many people to actually be able to do this. This all goes online next month on the Natural History Museum's website. In addition to the transcription of that manuscript, it's also being translated into English and into Maori. We have that's what it will look like when it's on their website. However, we do have an equivalent amount of material for the eastern coast of Australia. This, however, I had to put on hold as we did the kind of pilots with the colleagues and the Maori communities who I already have contact with. But we have a huge amount of material in comparison, and because of the diversity of plants here, rather than just being one volume, which I'm dealing with from New Zealand, we actually have 4 thick volumes of this. And again, you see them going through. But this only really picks up after they head further north of Sydney. But you do have the Indigenous names appearing, and you can see them here. And I'd be really interested, if any of you have any feedback of taking this forward, I'd be really genuinely interested to do this. But I know just how difficult it is, getting in touch with the Indigenous peoples who this information originally comes from. And I think it's essential to have their input on projects like this. This is just another example, but this actually, Solander thought he had to clarify and write the stem. It's not actually the name for the species, it's actually the particular part of this specific plant. So we've got, again, equivalent, and it goes through the whole process that I've just described. We've got the equivalent for Australia here. Now I'm going to move on to the actual practices of publishing.
10 minutes?
Yeah, 10, 15, that's what I've got. The actual practices of publishing this information. So Pennant is really interesting. He produces this book, The British Zoology. The first 2 volumes are arranged according to the system of John Ray. They relate to the birds and quadrupeds. The second 2 that relate to the fish, amphibia, and various testacea and shells are all arranged according to the Linnaean system. So it's actually quite a sort of inconsistent thing. And the reason for that is that Pennant had a strong belief that when observing the natural world, you had to take a more holistic view of quadrupeds and birds in particular, because of the land they inhabited, the sounds they made, not just an emphasis on their morphology, which is why he went for Ray's system. In comparison, the shells are just there, and they mostly inhabit water. And he thought the Linnaean system was perfectly adequate for this. So you really see here, this is the actual process of producing this book. The emphasis is on the hinge, which was very important to the Linnaean classification. But you have that is the actual specimen from Pennant's collection. Then you've got the image, which is almost, you really see how this was next to the artist while it was being produced. And then you've got the engraved plate here. You've got the same with some of his botanical work, which actually relates to the plants India. This is his last book. The interesting thing about Pennant is that all of the accounts of his books survive. We know exactly how they were made. We know exactly who he was employing to produce the plates. We know who he was buying the paper from. We also know that he did not make any money out of any of this. The really interesting thing that these accounts show is that he only ever intended to break even. And this really matches up with his whole gentlemanly ideal of defining oneself as a gentleman in the period, breaking even. In comparison, Banks has published several books that very little is actually known about, or published or printed, I would say. I'd probably say printed is a more accurate term. Published is perhaps pushing it. This is the Reliquiae Houstonianae on the plants of Central America and the West Indies, collected by William Houston. I only found these because of the presence of the printing plates for this particular book. Again, there's no accounts for Banks's books that survive. They really are artworks in their own sense. And then we obviously have the Florilegium. And what happens is manuscript material, specimens, illustrations are picked up after the voyage, and this is quite well known. And then this is the manuscript tracing through the name of the species. Then you've got NC, the locality, Nova Cambria, New South Wales. Then you've got the cross, which means the illustration was worked up from Parkinson's original draft. Then you've got the name of the engraver. Then you've got a star meaning the engraver has been completed. I'll discuss the Integuifolia, actually engraved by Charles White. And this is that particular illustration. So you see this whole process going through. The plates were actually chromed in the 1980s for the production of the well-known Banks's Florilegium project. This is the original pull taken in Banks's lifetime. He never intended for them to be published in colour, and that's really quite obvious when you look at all of the Linnaean rules in Philosophical Botanica for producing botanical illustrations. This is just to give an impression of the skill of these engravers. And many of these individuals, these artisanal types, just disappear into Banks's system for producing this, because many of them, Daniel Mackenzie is probably the most prominent in this collection. He just spent 40 years of his life working for Banks, living in the basement underneath Banks's library. So his artistic output doesn't go anywhere apart from to Banks. So it remains almost hidden away. This is another book that Banks had produced, Icones Selectae Plantarum, on the plants of Japan. Again, all of the plates survive. None of Pennant's plates survive, which is sort of particularly very interesting, based on the illustrations by Kempfer in the Natural History, or the British Museum, now the British Library. And you have the plate by Daniel Mackenzie. Then you've got print. Again, these are not textual books that Banks produces. They're very much what we regard as plate books now. And this is just some detail from that. So Pennant's accounts actually match up really nicely with what he has to say about publishing and how he actually distributes these books. He retains 20 copies to give away. I wish my publisher gave me that many copies. And then he always attempts to cover his expenses, but not actively profit from this process. So it very much fits with the kind of Enlightenment ideal of distributing new knowledge and information. And here is Pennant's actually 21 people who he gave his British zoology to. Thomas Falconer at the end is his brother-in-law, so he obviously had to add that one on by the look of it, as you do. And this is another book, another edition of British Zoology, and this is a subscription volume. And it's actually quite easy to tell exactly where the books go. And I was quite struck by just how far some copies of this book were actually travelling across Europe and into North America in the late 1760s. In comparison, Joseph Banks had a very different view on sending information out into the world in printed form. This is a quote from Forster, so it has to be taken with a pinch of salt, because Forster didn't really like Banks. They had serious political differences, especially by the 1780s. But he says the great work of Banks is still a topic that keeps the conversation alive. He will, as he says and writes to his friends, never sell it, but only print a few copies and give them away. And Banks himself says this also in this quote to the Duchess of Somerset. I have hitherto avoided the lash of the Scottish whippers in by quietly contenting myself with the station I hold in life. And then he says, I feel to be comfortable in seeking the reputation of an author, which in fact I do not consider a gentlemanly vocation. So he was very cautious. This is odd, given that he was president of the Royal Society, you know, responsible for distributing natural knowledge at this period. He was very, very cautious of ever seeing his name on a book, and also cautious with associating with commercial publishing that could cast a stain on this kind of gentlemanly reputation, i.e. associating him with essentially profiting from science. I think we've got to be very, very cautious to, I mean, it really shows a certain level of caution of trying to retain his position within society, but also distributing information. And this comes through really clearly in his distribution of some of the other books. So the Icones Selectae Plantarum, this is his response to a publisher, Christoph Frederick Cotter, who wrote to Banks asking to stock copies in his bookshop. And Banks he's pretty blunt in many of these responses, and there's several. The book referred to in your letter, Icones Camphenia, was published for the sake of my friends as a present for those who were so good as to assist me in forming my library. I have determined, therefore, never to sell or exchange it in any way. And he's very, very, very forthright about this. But what we can do is, because he essentially initiated a sort of aristocratic gift exchange, done also by people like Horace Walpole and Lord Bute in this period, we can tell you pretty much exactly where any copy that was sent out went. We know where the copies went, and they were usually given for a specific purpose. There are some copies untraceable. They were just given out at Banks's home. So there's no correspondence, obviously, surviving for those, but they made it India, China, North America, all around Europe, to nearly all the learned institutions. The one I'm just going to mention is the copy that actually made its way to China with Lord Macartney. It seems to have been given for two purposes: to aid the botanical collecting on the Macartney embassy to China, but also to be one of the objects laid before Qianlong, the Chinese emperor, in this particular scene here. It was given to George Leonard Staunton, you see there, who acted as a botanist on this particular expedition. And it was essentially designed to show the quality of what could be produced by British printers and publishers, because Banks employed basically, if you look at a list of what is the best materials you can ever buy in late 18th century Britain for producing a book, Banks bought them. That's sort of the end of it. So the quality is just exceptional. However, Banks was happy to engage with commercial publishing when he didn't have his name on it. So this is a document in the State Library of New South Wales. It's a bill for £4,841.18. This is for Staunton's authentic account of an embassy to China, published in 1797. And Banks actually managed the entire production and edited the text of this particular book. Banks also managed its distribution sort of semi-commercially. It's more like one of Thomas Pennant's books. And the reason Banks is happy to do this is because his name is not on the title page. He doesn't mind that much about Staunton obviously getting any discredit, but that seems to be the case as to what's going on here. He employs William Bulmer, who he refers to as the finest printer. And you really see this from the text, which is very, very just beautiful. It's the quality of the typeface is amazing. And then the illustrations, this is the T by Daniel Mackenzie again. So you see he employed this whole network of people to start producing this material. I'm just going to finish off by talking about how some of these books are actually used in contemporary society. So you've seen how they go out, and they go out all over the world. 5 minutes, probably.
3 minutes.
Okay. And you see them going out all over the world. This is an example of the quinine, or Cinchona officinalis, which originally comes from South America. And Banks is then sending this plate out, and you can see this is where he sent it. It's just an example of the quality again there. But one of the people he gave it to was Sigmund Backstrom, who distributed it up the western coast of America. And we actually have pictures of who he gave this plate to. The ideal was to break the Spanish monopoly on this species in South America and find examples that could be cultivated in British India at the time, which is useful when they're essentially invading India to use it as the medicine for the Indian army. Again, for Pennant, you see books, not a single copy without an annotation. You also see his own copies full of this material. They're expanding so much the spines have split apart and ripped them apart and sent them to people, and they're reallocated. He would extend between each edition with the information coming back over 100 pages, if not adding a volume. No publisher now would ever allow you to do that. And then we have with Banks, again, you saw the copy of Species Plantarum before. You then see going through a successor edition. This is the Systema Plantarum. See, there's some information there recorded about the introduction of potatoes into Britain. This is then transcribed into the next edition, which then becomes the next keystone in managing Banks' library. Then you see in Robert Brown's copy that is there as well. This is the copy that he took on the Investigator with Matthew Flinders around Australia. This is so he had the most up-to-date count of all of the plants, all of the known plants. Again, this is some more Pennant, and I don't know why that ended up there. However, these projects had a finite life. For Pennant, changes in the publishing market really put an end to what is going on and how to manage this, sort of both in terms of the information, but in terms of actually the economics of what's going on. It was a very fine balance as to what he's doing. For Banks, in comparison, it's completely pinned to the individual. So it relied on his private personal wealth. When he dies, these projects sort of cease to exist. You see them start to be replaced by subscription projects like the Ray Society in the 19th century, but without that, you don't see really anyone else putting this sort of wealth into these kinds of projects. So I'll just finish off by saying that going back to some of the Endeavour material and the Indigenous knowledge, that is really interesting because it ends up in Banks's library in Soho Square, and he's very, very, how to describe it, sort of touchy. He essentially censors people who have access to this material, and there's quite a lot of reasons for that. One of the reasons is that he thinks you need to be responsible enough to actually use it and present it to, he essentially gives access to Linnaean botanists who seem to have sufficient calibre to examine it. One of the reasons he's quite touchy about it is, especially in the 1780s and 1790s, the political connotations associated with the Pacific seem to have encouraged him to basically not let any literate person have access. And this also seems to be one of the things that shuts down his interest in actually publishing on it. Also, Solander dies halfway through the process, so the steam sort of falls out of this project. So in the end, this material remained relatively unknown within the Natural History Museum. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I've tried to put some of it actually out there as part of the ongoing project. But I'm going to stop speaking now, so thank you.